In the summer of 1943, the fields of western Russia were silent, vast stretches of open land waiting for war. Beneath the stillness, both armies prepared for one of the greatest clashes in human history. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler's empire stood on the edge of defeat. His armies had been driven back thousands of miles, his legend of invincibility shattered. But he refused to accept failure. To him, one decisive victory could change everything. That victory, he believed, would come at Kursk. The city of Kursk jutted out into the German lines like a massive bulge, a vulnerable target, and the perfect opportunity to strike. Hitler called the plan Operation Citadel. Its goal was simple: launch a massive attack from north and south, trap the Soviet armies inside the bulge, and destroy them. The German generals promised success. They had new weapons, new tanks, and fresh confidence. The mighty Tiger and Panther tanks, heavily armored, armed with long 80mm guns, were ready to crush anything in their path. The Führer called it his iron fist. He believed these machines would restore German dominance on the eastern front, but on the other side of the line, the Soviet Union had learned well from Stalingrad. They knew the Germans were coming, and they were ready. Soviet intelligence, through spies and intercepted messages, had uncovered nearly every detail of Hitler's plan. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of Soviet defense, prepared an answer unlike anything seen before. His men dug in across hundreds of miles, building a fortress of trenches, mines, and guns, over 3,000 kilometers of defenses, more than 400,000 mines, thousands of artillery pieces hidden across the fields. It was not a city that would fight the Germans this time. It was the land itself. For weeks, both armies prepared in silence. Tank crews studied maps and cleaned their guns. Pilots memorized routes over the steppe. Commanders waited for the order to move. By early July, over 900,000 German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft stood ready to attack. Facing them were 1.3 million Soviet troops, 3,600 tanks, and lines of fortifications stretching to the horizon. The Germans believed they would strike swiftly and crush the Soviets within days. But the Red Army had no intention of retreating. They would fight for every inch of ground. On July 4th, the air was thick with heat and tension. Soldiers on both sides smoked their last cigarettes, wrote letters home, and stared into the distance. They knew what was coming. At dawn the next day, the silence was shattered. Soviet artillery opened fire first, a preemptive barrage that shook the ground and tore into the German staging areas. The sky lit up with thunder and flame, but it was only a brief delay. Within hours, the German Panzers began their advance. Engines roared, treads crushed the earth, and clouds of dust rose as the offensive began. From the north, General Model's 9th Army moved toward the Soviet strongholds near Okhovatka. From the south, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army pushed toward Prokhorovka, the point where both German pincers would meet. It was a storm of steel. Tanks rolled forward, guns blazing. The first minefields exploded beneath their tracks. Soviet anti-tank guns opened fire, knocking out the leading vehicles. But the Germans kept coming, relentless, disciplined, confident in their machines. By the end of the first day, the fields of Kursk were covered in smoke and wreckage. The Germans had gained ground, but not victory. Every mile cost them dearly. Hitler had promised that Kursk would be the turning point of the war. But what he didn't know was that the Soviets had turned the battlefield itself into a trap. The German spearheads were advancing deeper and deeper into a storm they could not escape. The Battle of Kursk had only just begun. The morning of July 6, 1943, the fields of Kursk were burning. German armor pushed forward, but every meter of ground was paid for in blood and steel. The Soviet defenses, dug deep and layered like the rings of a fortress, slowed the panzers to a crawl. Each trench captured was another waiting to be fought for. Each field cleared of mines revealed another stretch of wire and guns beyond it. Hitler's generals had promised him a lightning victory. But there was nothing swift about Kursk. The steppe had become a slow, grinding storm. In the north, General Model's troops advanced toward the town of Okhovatka. The terrain was unforgiving, steep ridges, soft ground, and endless artillery fire. German soldiers called it Hell's Corridor. The Tigers and Panthers, so feared and powerful, were forced to inch forward through narrow lanes filled with wrecks. The Soviets had dug in so deep that some units were practically buried alive. Machine gunners fired from underground bunkers. Anti-tank crews waited in silence until the German tanks were almost on top of them before unleashing fire. The battlefield became a wasteland of smoke and shattered metal. Tank tracks burned red-hot from constant movement. The smell of oil and blood filled the air. In the south, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army met the full fury of the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. The Germans fought with desperation, but they were walking into a plan designed months in advance. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov had predicted every move. While the Germans believed they were attacking, they were in fact entering a carefully prepared killing ground, a battlefield that would consume them. For every Panther that roared forward, there were dozens of hidden Soviet guns waiting. For every Tiger that fired, Soviet artillery zeroed in on its position within minutes. The Germans tried to adapt. They brought in air support. Waves of Stuka dive bombers screamed over the fields, their sirens wailing. But the Red Air Force met them in the skies. Dogfights raged above the smoking earth, tracer rounds lighting up the clouds like lightning. By the third day, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. Units that were supposed to cover 10 miles a day were barely managing 2. Supply lines broke down. Fuel ran low. Communications failed. The once unbreakable German war machine was beginning to overheat, and still Hitler demanded progress. His commanders sent back desperate messages, begging for reinforcements, more time, more men. But time was exactly what the Soviets wanted them to lose. Zhukov's trap was working perfectly. The German army was being drawn deeper and deeper into a battlefield they could no longer control. Then, on July 10th, a new order came down from Moscow. It was time to strike back. From the north and the south, Soviet reserves began to move. Entire tank armies that had waited silently for days roared to life. The counterattack was about to begin. As dawn broke on July 11th, the sound of engines rolled across the plains like thunder. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army surged forward toward the small railway station of Prokhorovka, a name that would soon become legend. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. They had no idea the scale of the counteroffensive that was coming. They believed the Soviets were breaking. But in truth, the Red Army was gathering its full strength for one decisive blow. By now, over 1,500 tanks were converging on a battlefield barely 15 kilometers wide. Dust and smoke choked the air, radio signals jammed. No one could see beyond a few hundred meters. Commanders gave up trying to coordinate. It was chaos, a storm of armor, shells, and fire. In Berlin, Hitler waited for news that never came. Each day the reports grew worse. Heavy losses, stalled progress, Soviet counterattacks on every front. And yet he refused to believe his offensive was failing. He called Kursk the key to victory, convinced that one final push would break the Soviet line. But that line wasn't breaking, it was bending, just enough to pull the Germans in. By July 12th, both armies stood face to face near Prokhorovka, thousands of tanks positioned across open fields. Soviet T-34s, faster and more maneuverable, were ready to charge. German Tigers, massive and heavily armored, waited in silence, their cannons aimed low and steady. The stage was set for the largest tank battle in human history. The trap was complete. The hammer was about to fall. July 12, 1943. The dawn broke red over the fields near a small railway station called Prokhorovka. The air was heavy with dust and smoke, the ground trembling beneath the weight of hundreds of engines. What was about to unfold would become the largest tank battle in human history. The Germans believed they were on the verge of victory. Their southern offensive had driven deep into Soviet lines. Their elite divisions, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, stood ready for one final push. Ahead of them lay open fields and scattered Soviet defenses. They thought the Red Army was breaking. They were wrong. Across those same fields, hidden behind shallow ridges and low clouds of smoke, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army was gathering. Hundreds upon hundreds of T-34s and light tanks waiting for a single command. At 8:30 a.m., the order came. Engines roared to life, and the earth seemed to shake. The Soviet tanks surged forward, waves of steel charging straight into the German lines. Dust rose in thick curtains, hiding everything from sight. Within minutes, the two armies collided in a storm of fire and metal. There were no clean formations, no perfect tactics. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Tanks rammed each other at point-blank range. Machine guns rattled. Shells screamed past at deadly speed. In the blinding dust, men could barely tell friend from foe. German Tigers and Panthers tried to hold their ground, their long guns firing through the haze, destroying Soviet tanks one after another. But the T-34s kept coming. Fast, fearless, unstoppable. Soviet crews drove straight into the enemy ranks, closing the distance where the German advantage vanished. At times, tanks crashed into each other like beasts locked in combat. Turrets turned, shells exploded, and burning wrecks littered the fields. The grass caught fire and black smoke swallowed the sun. Inside the tanks, it was hell. Temperatures soared past 60 degrees. Metal burned to the touch. The air was thick with fumes and screams. Commanders shouted over the roar of engines, giving orders that could barely be heard. One German officer later wrote, "It was not a battle. It was an inferno. We could see nothing, only fire and dust, and the silhouettes of tanks bursting into flames. In the chaos, courage and fear blurred together. Soviet tank crews charged headlong into Tiger tanks, knowing their own shells could barely pierce the armor, but hoping to disable them with rams and explosives. Many never returned. Yet their sacrifice bought time and momentum. Above them, the sky was filled with warplanes. Soviet IL-2s and German Stukas battled over the burning fields, adding to the storm below. Bombs fell among the tanks, lifting soil and bodies into the air. By midday, Prokhorovka had become a vision of destruction. Over 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns were locked in combat. The ground itself shook beneath the weight of the machines. Every few seconds, another explosion sent fire rolling across the steppe. Still, neither side broke. The Germans fought with skill and precision. Their Tigers claimed dozens of kills. Their discipline held firm under chaos. But they were bleeding, and every loss hit harder than they could afford. The Soviets fought with ferocity and sheer will. For every T-34 that burned, another came forward. Soviet infantry followed in the tracks of their tanks, throwing grenades, firing rifles, dragging wounded comrades to safety. They were not fighting for ground anymore. They were fighting for survival, for revenge, for the homeland. As the sun began to fall, both armies were exhausted. The battlefield was littered with wreckage, blackened hulls, twisted metal, and silence broken only by the crackle of burning fuel. The Germans had advanced barely a few kilometers. The Soviets still held the field. That night, both sides withdrew to regroup. Commanders counted their dead. Thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, gone in a single day. The Battle of Prokhorovka had ended, but its outcome would echo across the entire war. The Germans had thrown their best forces into the fight and gained nothing. The Red Army had endured the heaviest blow the Wehrmacht could deliver, and survived. For Hitler, Kursk was supposed to be the battle that restored his dominance in the east. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. The German advance had stopped. Their armored might was broken. And in Moscow, the Soviet commanders knew that their time had come. The tide of war was about to turn. The fields of Kursk were silent once again. Smoke drifted over the ruins of tanks and men. What had begun as Germany's boldest offensive had ended in ashes. For days, the fighting continued in scattered bursts. German divisions tried to regroup, to strike again, but their strength was gone. Their tanks were crippled, their fuel running dry, their soldiers exhausted beyond recovery. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. He demanded that his armies press forward, that they seize Kursk no matter the cost. But even as he shouted orders from his bunker, news arrived that changed everything. On July 10th, just as the battle reached its peak, the Allies had landed in Sicily. A new front had opened in the west. Germany's war was no longer one of offense. It was a desperate defense on every front. Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The order went out quietly, almost in defeat. The offensive was over. On the ground, German soldiers knew what that meant. For the first time since the war began, they were not advancing, they were retreating. Across the steppe, the Red Army rose from the ruins. Soviet commanders wasted no time. They launched a massive counteroffensive, striking north and south, pushing the enemy back mile by mile. The Germans who had come to crush the Soviets now found themselves being hunted. Everywhere they turned, Soviet artillery thundered. T-34s rolled forward like a tide of steel. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in the skies, was overwhelmed by swarms of Soviet fighters. The dream of victory in the east was dead. The Wehrmacht, once feared, disciplined, unstoppable, was broken and bleeding, forced into a retreat that would never end. By August, the German line had collapsed. The cities of Orel and Belgorod fell within days. Soviet flags rose over the burning ruins. Crowds in Moscow cheered as sirens wailed and fireworks lit up the night sky. For the first time, the people of the Soviet Union believed the impossible. They were winning. The Battle of Kursk had lasted just over a month, but its consequences would shape the rest of the war. Germany lost nearly 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, and any hope of regaining the initiative. From that moment on, the Red Army would never stop advancing. from Kursk to Kiev, from Kiev to Warsaw, and finally, from Warsaw to Berlin. The Germans had gambled everything on one final strike and lost it all. The balance of power had shifted forever. Historians would later call Kursk the turning point of World War II, the battle that proved that Hitler's war machine could be defeated, not just by numbers, but by endurance, intelligence, and sheer will. One Soviet commander described it simply, "At Kursk, we stopped them. After Kursk, we chased them." The battlefield itself became a graveyard of iron. Thousands of tanks still lay scattered across the plains, silent witnesses to the day when machines ruled the war and humanity paid the price. For the soldiers who survived, the memories never faded. The noise, the fire, the smell of burning steel, the faces of comrades who never came home. They had fought in the greatest armored battle the world had ever seen, a clash so vast it shook the earth and changed the course of history. Kursk was more than just a battle. It was the moment when one empire's ambition met another's determination, and the fate of the world was decided in the fields of Russia. The German army would fight for nearly 2 more years, but after Kursk they would never again choose where the war was fought, only where it was lost. And so, as the smoke cleared and the sun set over the wreckage, one truth remained. The age of the blitzkrieg was over. The tide of war had turned, and from the ashes of Kursk, a new world began to rise.